right. Jazz Cabbage. Start off with Thompson. Mr. Hashbash.
Yo.
And Harb.
What's up?
Hey, everybody. And just to make sure it happens, because I've skipped it a couple times recently, we'll throw on the sponsors here and
Why not? What the hell?
let Rick let us know who they are.
Yeah, Jazz Cabbage is sponsored by the Botanical Company. Redemption Cannabis. Real leaf solutions. SmokingMI.com. Custom 420 promos featuring culture clothing.
Right on. So, Kalkushka, the social use lounge up in Kalkaska, is just about ready to open right directly next door to the Botanical Company, downtown Kalkaska. Be a couple of private shindigs coming up soon, next week, to kind of start it off. Then it's open to the public early June 1st, I believe. Then there'll be some other like openings and launchings of the associated stuff, and I think it'll be like a grand opening in July and stuff. But it's going to get up and running this month and then open to the public next month.
June 1st, I saw.
Yeah. So it'll be a couple private parties like late May and then June 1st open to the public. And then one of them will be a Glen 1 year anniversary private gathering.
Be nice.
So that'll be a good one. The other one's kind of invitation to surrounding area industry people for the staff itself, all that kind of stuff, just to get it started. So it's very exciting. Looking forward to it. And the other stuff that'll be coming. So, and we will talk about that. So, hey, I wanted to mention to you before I forgot, because I usually do, that I went to Winewood Organics, as I said I would, and it was a great experience. Beautiful place, great people. They hooked me up, and I got the hash that I was after. Really nice packaging. You can get it in an 1/8 or a gram. This is the Skunky Bubble hash, and you can get it loose or in a puck. That's the puck version. Lots of great essence, really clean. Very cool place. And they got like the rosin pen. Or I don't normally like these, but this tastes like great hash. And they've got a system there where there's no other than a process of heating, decarboxylation, and getting the right viscosity here for these cartridges. It's all pure. It just tastes great and nice little punch in the head. I like it when I'm smoking, and they got some Durban Poison flower. That was great. And some gummies. So it was, it's a great place to go. It's my place in Ann Arbor from now on.
For the record, I actually went there also, but I forgot my driver's license.
And they knew better than to serve you. That's perfect.
Yeah, but that's all right. I'll be back.
Yeah, it's worth it. And so have Eric back on here. We talked about maybe some projects with helping out with maybe Sinclair Foundation and/or Glenn and stuff like that. And that could come to fruition. So we'll stay in touch on that. I also wanted to mention that Emerald Cup has created new categories for flower that try to stay away from the labels of sativa, indica, and stuff, and rely more on the terpene profile. I thought that's really cool and a good start. That seems to be an advanced pool of thinkers and people with experience on cannabis coming out of the Emerald Cup arena. That it would seem fitting that they would kind of take the lead on doing something like this, but it is kind of necessary.
I did read their literature. They have 4 categories based on heredity of the cannabis, and then a 5th, which is exotics, which kind of catches everything else. So, right. I mean, that's the most in-depth way anybody's tried to categorize for competition cannabis that I'm aware of. It's a strong move forward, I think.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty cool. We'll probably do like an expanded show just on the issue at large again. We've kind of done some stuff like that in the past. And
I appreciated when they talked about exotics, Rick. They were breaking it down by the terpene profile, not by people just label things as exotic by genetic makeup, and it doesn't really make sense. So they seem to have put a lot of thought into their process.
Well, the fact is, if you're testing every cannabis before it goes into the competition, you basically know where it falls in. These are the ones with lots of linalool. These are the ones with lots of pinene. You can make an apples to apples much better than some kind of a generic category. I remember when it was sativa hybrid and indica, that was really so indistinct, and there was such crossover in between the others.
That's still common. That's
Right.
there's still a need for a transition there, kind of. It's
Amen. Yeah, I agree. Praise all the way around for Emerald Cup. Mr. Hashbash, you've been to Emerald Cup, have you not, sir?
Yes, I was there.
And I think you had some comments about it. You thought it was a
yeah. I mean, it's a unique. It's an industry event now. It's even though they have a small garden grow as part of their industry, things that we don't have that we're just getting. Their industry kind of has forced some of this because the little guy was trying to differentiate himself, and there's only one way to differentiate yourself, and that is through a terpene profile. And really, what this is just science catching up with the stoner.
yeah.
And once the stoner figured out that there was a better way, he went with it. And these guys out in Cali, they've been working the terpene profiles for a while.
And the stoner, of course, has a lot of experience hearing these labels, using the cannabis with others, and seeing how there's not this consistent,
Right.
Application of these terms versus the predicted effect and that kind of stuff. So they know that there's got to be a better way of looking at this.
And if you've been doing this long enough, you smoked some 7, 8, 9, 12 percenters back in the day that had such a terpene profile, they got you whacked. And, we miss those things. Mind you, we're generations away from them. But those old strains that used to come in that brickweed, it might have been lower THC, but those terpene profiles were sure there.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked extensively on this program too about how sometimes strain names get changed for commercial purpose, so that the name of the strain itself no longer reflects what the cannabis actually is, or where it's been derived from, simply because of marketing purposes and such. So, Jamie's got the nose right on it on this whole issue here.
Yeah. You want to see what's inside the plant. That's the best information for the consumer. And I think the way the competition is starting to do this will help bring more light to that, hopefully.
The difference is that the consumer is not really part of the competition. That this is really a heady competition.
No, they're separate. There are separate things, but this
Right.
is the beginning of the transaction.
Correct.
Or the transition where you start looking at it like this. It's going to be helpful.
Yeah.
This is where the custody is about to get educated. And, one day is going to, which is interesting because we're forcing, what do we call them, bud tenders? We're forcing these retailers to actually have to educate their staff, because you won't be able to do this based on some label put next to a product sitting on a shelf.
And it's hard too. I've tried to, different staffs, different places to impart this, kind of different perspective to be aware of. But it's been internalized for many people. And then people walk in and they speak like this with confidence. And this is just how we all look at it. I know what I'm talking about. I want a high THC sativa, whatever. I want to clean my garage or whatever bullshit. They just get accommodated and, you move on. But meanwhile, there was no really good information exchange, there moving forward. So it's really hard to make that transition wherever you are. And then the market in part is still based on how high the THC is. You still see people charging more in the wholesale market. Luckily, though, you go into some stores, and I'm happy about this. I think that's kind of what they're trying to do with these different terpene.
So read the statement for our audio only guests, though.
Yeah. Do they still do earth, gas, floral, fruit categories? I think that's what I heard Kevin Georgery say about that cup. I think that is a good description of how they're trying to group the terpenes for these categories.
We talked about the 4 different groups and then the exotics. I think that's basically what the 4 different groups were. They had references not just to the terpenes but to their effect, and tried to group them that way. And that, although they didn't break it down the way that you did, that was, I think, the catch. Good job, man. Good job. Patty McDonald says it's all about the terps. I think most of us agree with that too. I spend a lot of time in dispensaries nowadays in cannabis retail locations here in Michigan. Sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, I'm at these different things doing public appearances. And I can tell you that there is very much still an audience there that says, give me the cheapest pre-roll or give me the highest THC flower.
Well, yeah.
So those are market elements that will always be there. But we can't dumb down the industry to their level. What we have to do is provide the information at a level where people can make medically appropriate decisions for themselves.
So, and it's tough, like I was saying, because people will walk in, and you certainly don't want to start something that makes that person believe that you're telling them that they're wrong about something, or you're creating like a conflict, because of how they've learned to look at this, which is illegitimate just based on how things are, the common beliefs of cannabis. When we make it a little bit more black and white and easier to understand by, indica, sativa, THC, high or low, it's something that's kind of gotten internalized because it's been an easy way to kind of look at it. But that evaluation isn't really that substantive. And to start that conversation with somebody and looking at it a different way is not real easy. I mean, it's, to kind of peel back what you've internalized already and look at it a new way. And that's, never really simple or quick.
It's not only about the terpene profiles too. It's about promoting that entourage effect. How do these cannabinoid profiles interact with the terpenes? We have we're learning more about CBG and all these
all the components of the plants working
and how they really just the synergy between the cannabinoids and the terpene profiles. That's where the medicinal value for me is.
And we know there's some consistency when some of the cannabinoids are higher in composition, and they have the CBN is higher, so it's more relaxing, and those things have been consistent. Or I'm not sure where they are in terms of a study and being proven to be caused of each other, but I mean, a lot of this is new, and more studies are needed. And when we look at this, we are looking at it somewhat anecdotally in combination with some studies that are, valid and supportive of some of this thought. But it's all a new thing, really, because we're just now starting to pave the way for this type of research.
This just underscores what we've been saying for a very, very long time, that whole plant medicine is what we need. We need the whole plant to be able to inhale into our respiratory system instead of a chemically derived single essence. I don't need THC-A by itself. I don't need THC-G by itself. I want to do a combination of those things in order to get the effect. I want to have access to whole plant medicine.
But some people might
things we were worried about when we pharmaceuticalized this was that we were going to lose access to whole plant medicines. Go ahead.
Right. Somebody might benefit from some
for sure,
an isolate, like I guess that would be in.
I've got it right here on my desk. Many people do, but we still
don't want it at the cost of like totally getting away from the plant where all the components, the cannabinoids, the terpenes, the flavonoids, whatever else is in there that I probably can't name or pronounce, all work synergistically.
Wouldn't it be interesting one day to be able to take it, spike your joint with a little bit of limonene, right? You'd have that in a powdered substance, and
maybe that happens.
You can. It's just expensive.
I bet that's true. You know what?
It's already done. And matter of fact, we ran through this a couple weeks ago. The big thing out on the East Coast and the West Coast is terp pre-rolled joints, and they're very flavorful. And I thought they were nasty, but talking to the guy that produces them, come to find out he sells 80,000 of these things a month.
Yeah, but they drive terpenes from broccoli and such. It's not.
But it is, though. That's when you learn about terpenes, Rick.
Yeah,
that's what terpenes are.
Molecularly, they are, but they don't work in the same combinations. And people try to reintroduce these things back together. It tastes really fake a lot of times. You can just tell there's artificially
because they're doing it wrong.
But sometimes there are balances that people have achieved that are pleasant, and they taste good and they seem a little bit more, I don't know, natural.
All the distillate carts that taste good are terped perfectly.
They're spiked with terp, yeah.
It's the ones that taste like shit that are terped poorly. I have the greatest thing of all time sits on my desk right here. I use this as the example. This is this big baller thing that I was a judge for a high times competition probably 3-4 years ago. And this thing makes huge clouds because of the big mouthpiece and the way it works and all this.
Make
The
these
only
big
problem is the company or whoever it was that made the product inside put probably 3 times as much terps as they needed to. So it tasted like you were, you know, it was like an orange gusher as opposed to a faint orange taste. And we all agreed had they terped with about a third of what they used, they'd have won. But
Yeah, they kind of forced it so it seemed artificial, kind of.
Right,
It's
right.
I hate
using
that.
too much salt
Fake.
in a recipe is exactly what it's like. A little salt is a good thing. Too much salt, you can ruin it. Baked tater here is making a comment. Terpene fusion makes for trash product.
And oftentimes
that
is true. You know,
What we're trying to say though is that there's a methodology where you can infuse terps on a gentle level.
There's
for the right balance of things.
There are brands that's what their product is. It's terp infused products. It's about understanding the terpenes and knowing how they work and knowing what you need and all of that.
Anton and I know that we just had a conversation with the director of the Cannabis Regulatory Agency last month, or actually this month rather, on the first Monday. And I asked about terp infusion at that particular time. And I said, is terp infusion allowed in a post-testing scenario, or all the terps have to be added prior to testing? And we were assured that all the terps had to be added prior to testing. I'm concerned, though, that that's not always the way things go, right? I mean, we've always heard stories about people who will take a little spray, to enhance the scent of their cannabis. In a post-testing world, a couple little shots into an ounce bag, you make your cannabis smell really good.
Oh, you brought up the point, Rick, I believe, during that meeting, was the hydration pillows that they'll add to a jar, an eighth or whatever, of flour that has terp infusions within that, within the pillow to hydrate the bud or whatever. And you don't know
the terp smell. Yeah.
I mean, they're volatile oils. They're volatile compounds. It's I don't think we really know how that stuff works, like you say, post-testing. So it's interesting. I had an interesting conversation with Judge Strains at Harry Barish's event last week, and he was telling me about blood tests that they're coming out with to test, like, what terpene profiles will match with the individual person. And he was going to get me some more information on this, and I was really interested because he said what they want to do is with veterans try and match these terpene profiles that may help with PTSD or TBI or things like that. And I thought it was a really interesting idea. Like, how cool would that be if we could actually nail down individual terp profiles to a specific person and then match them with a particular product? I mean, that's like that's new age, that's revolutionary stuff. So
it'd be based on what you perceive their deficiencies would be, right? If you take
that's what I was going to ask too. Yeah, because,
right. Well,
yep.
We're
joined by Avi Zallen. We'll introduce you a little bit better soon.
Oh no,
Avi's mobile.
He doesn't realize it. Okay.
I've been wanting to make mention of this, and I know we're in the middle of a good conversation, but Adam received a special honor, and I would like to call attention to it, even if he's not doing it on his own. Malcolm McKinnon submitted to a museum in New York City pictures of famous Jewish people that have been instrumental
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Law reform movement, and Adam Brook is one of those. And that picture that he took of Adam on the stage at Hash Bash with thousands of people behind him is really the iconic Mr. Hash Bash photo.
Nice.
And we've all had individual successes here and there, but that is something that I think really deserved a little bit of recognition and maybe appreciation. So
right.
I appreciate that.
Well, your colorful yarmulke remind me of that. Was that gifted to you?
No, it was not.
Hmm.
But I know what you were going to say.
Yeah.
No, it was not. I thought about it this morning when I put it on.
Our friend who's passed away was an attorney and a well-known believer in the Hebrew ways. So he was noted for having a knit yarmulke that he wore everywhere. So
yeah, I'm trying to get out to that exhibit in New York. Goes until December, so trying to get out and check that out. It's kind of cool.
Hey, so we'll get more expansive, maybe later on, but I do want to mention here. So Avi Zallen, is it Zallen? Proper
Yep.
way to, okay.
Yep.
Founder, CEO of Steadfast Labs, based out of Hazel Park, cannabis testing lab. We'll talk about what's going on in the testing world in Michigan and other interesting things, and how the stuff that we've seen, just kind of happen with the state and some of these things, and how it's been affecting, stuff, and just whatever insights, are interesting that we have on this. I know we had a little conversation. I thought some people might be also interested in some of that stuff. But we do want to bring up the fact that the anti-caregiver bad cannabis bills are gaining momentum. We have the 5512 that got passed out of the House, and is now going to be brought up in committee and gone through the process in the Senate very soon. Then meanwhile, a lot of the bills that were designed to peel back existing caregiver rights with the big money interest groups and so forth in the House that were kind of slowed down by a lot of our efforts is gaining momentum in the Senate. We've talked about it here before. The MCMA's hired other people to help out with that. Mark Fisk from Byram Fisk, big public relations organization, to help get some of the Democrats on board with that, and then try to go from that direction and bring that momentum back to the House, which it would be helpful to them to do that, because then they'd say that half the process is done. Your peers supported this. This is something that needs a super majority. So,
and the only reason they have to go to the Senate and appeal to them is because we effectively, as a community, gathered together our forces in 2021 and told our legislators not to pass this bill. It passed out of committee, but it has never been given a vote in the full House, because at this particular time we've successfully got the House to believe it's not a good bill. So approaching it from the Senate is the only way to advance it at this point.
And there's still like there's a lobby day coming up May 19th, and some people are going to participate in that. And if so, some people are gathering around the Radisson Hotel about 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning, and then otherwise meeting up at the MICIA offices midday. Thanks to Robin Schneider, and satisfying, hopefully, appointments made with their state senator and/or state House rep. And the House rep is still important to talk to, because to request that they maintain their position on this, even if it does come back in from the Senate, would be very important. Otherwise, we'll start seeing the dominoes fall in the wrong way. And then, of course, to hit right at the Senate, and there's 5512 that is now going to be under consideration soon there. And there is the arena in which these anti-caregiver bills, which are like 5301, if you remember, peeling back plant count, creating this dysfunctional system where supposedly caregivers could bring cannabis back to the market, smoke and mirror section. It's primarily based around tearing down the existing caregiver system.
Well, and there's no secret about that, because Linda has actually come out and said that's it.
Yeah. Individual members have said it of the MCMA, and then also they are clear about wanting to hurt small business too. I mean, so anything that's not them is something they believe would be best suited if they step on it.
For those people that are watching that are not in Michigan and may not be familiar with our system here, in Michigan, we have about 250,000 patients registered under our medical program. Certain people can be considered caregivers, which can grow on behalf of that patient. A caregiver can currently grow on behalf of 5 patients, which give an allowance of 12 plants for a total of 60 plants as a caregiver. If that caregiver also happens to be a patient, then they can grow a total of 72 plants for their 5 patients as well as for themselves. And the proposal that we're discussing here would remove the ability to produce for 5 patients and take it down to just 1 single patient, which would legitimately take 80% of the ability for caregivers to be compassionate to their fellow man away. And it's true that not all of the 30-some thousand caregivers service all 5 patients, but they all could if they wished. And the way the market's going right now, it's possible caregivers to be in greater need than ever before. We're seeing a reduction of the medical program in Michigan. Fewer retailers are offering medical quality product. And patient and caregiver numbers are shrinking. So those people that know what they're doing and know how to take care of patients on a medical level, they are more precious and in shorter supply than ever before. This particular bill would really cut the legs out of the patient caregiver relationship in Michigan, and do so exclusively for the impression of a gained market share, which I think we've mentioned on the show many times.
It highlights their ignorance. I mean, their lack of understanding of what the conditions are, and
it's an illusion. Yep. If you take my caregiver away from me, I will never use your stores ever, ever, ever.
We're going to smash all these other systems where people have been getting cannabis, without incident for years, in an attempt to entice people into our stores.
So that's one of the reasons why we're so passionate about this set of bills. For those people who have been following Jazz Cabbage for a while and have heard us talk about it, in Michigan, every pediatric patient that exists has to, by law, have a caregiver attached to them, which is one of their parents. So when you're talking about reducing the ability for a caregiver to provide for a sick child, oftentimes it's a sad thing to say, but oftentimes sick children come in clusters. You may have 2 or 3 sick children in a single home. And when your parent is required to be your caregiver, a law like this would really make some parents make some very tough choices. And I think we all agree that most caregivers who are caring for a sick person are probably not going to adhere to a law that they didn't sponsor, support, or understand. And that's just going to turn average citizens into accidental criminals. And that's the antithesis of what we're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to protect people. Avi's here because he's in the protect people business, right? I mean, the whole thing that we're doing here is trying to give people the correct information so that they can stay safe. And that was a bill that would open up the pathway to a non-safe door.
So it's unilaterally driven by a big money interest group. That should be a red flag, and we were successful in letting the House representatives know that this was done without meaningful input from stakeholders. Hopefully, some people will also have some senators will also find that to be, important. But what they say is that there are these people who become a caregiver and then use that as a guise to open up a legal business and sell to anybody and just do whatever they want and all that kind of stuff. So I think they exaggerate how often something like that actually happens, but whether or not it does, it's already exceeds limitations. It's already outside of protections. It's already illegal. All they do is hurt people who have been following the proper guidelines and staying within limitations for now 13 years, I guess 14 years almost.
While their numbers have continued to grow.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to plead poverty when you're in the middle of a $2 billion industry that's on this kind of a trajectory.
Right.
So
and the registered legitimate numbers of medical patients and caregivers continues to wane. So, naturally they're getting what they want. Why? What return on investment? That's what I don't understand. Something's not right here.
At this particular time, I think you're still looking at a few people who don't fully understand the industry, trying to make decisions. And here's the thing. When you have 17 dispensaries across the state, a 0.25% increase in sales translates into a significant amount of money for your industry. If you believe that you can scrape even a small market improvement out of Michigan's system by hurting patients and caregivers, I believe that that's enough of an incentive for some of these big guys to want to go for it. Because we're really talking about even tiny incremental changes making a big difference in profitability for some of these larger companies. I saw it with Art Van Furniture too. We had stores all across the state when I was a manager there. And oftentimes it didn't matter what our margin was individually because, you could make it up other places. Right. Similar thing.
Well, and it's interesting because it's interesting you bring up Art Van, because my father was also in the dinette business. And one thing that we learned early on was, I learned this and it carried me through, that there are deals that are made in industry that don't necessarily make sense to anybody other than the people who are making the deal. And in the dinette business, for instance, as an example, the almond colored top was available to Art Van, but nobody else could buy that from the manufacturer. And they would buy it, put it in a warehouse, and bring it out a year later. And it was outdated and out-colored, and nobody could compete with it. And it was a loss leader. And you'd have people come into your store looking for something that the big guy was advertising in a, an ad, and you couldn't touch it. You couldn't come anywhere near that price. You didn't have that color. You didn't have, and that set them apart from everybody else, because in reality, everybody's selling the same damn stuff. And that's what's happening in the weed game, is that what are we going to do to set ourselves apart? We talked about it a little earlier. Some of these people are terping their product now. Some of these people are doing fancy packaging like that makes a difference. It's all the same.
Well, you really got to be careful now, and consumers really, thanks for the introductions, guys. And, we're at Steadfast Labs. We're all about consumer protection. And it's a really big problem in the industry of inaccurate lab testing that we see every day. You see moldy weed passing, you see potency inflation just getting worse and worse. And consumers are the ones that are damaged. Consumers are the ones they're going to the store, they're looking at a number on a label, they're paying more for that number when the number's not even real in the first place. And so my strong suggestion to consumers to protect yourselves and to avoid getting ripped off is to know your labs. Do your own research, figure out what labs are really in the game for the right reasons. They're doing things to protect consumers and not just trying for this money grab that we see more and more of, unfortunately, in the industry.
Right. I want to go back real quick to this because Chris says, isn't the ultimate hope to eliminate home grows altogether? And I would say yes. Ultimately, the same arguments being used right now for what they call caregiver grows, which are really just grows that exceed limitations already, can be used concerning just a regular home grow that's permitted right now for an adult ultimately. And I don't think they stop when they start gaining traction with.
For those people outside the state, here in Michigan, as a patient, you have the entitlement to 12 plants, but as a adult over 21, you also have the entitlement to 12 plants, 2 different programs. So if they're coming after the 12 plant allowance for the medical patients, it does stand to reason that sooner or later they'll go after the 12 plant home cultivation allowance for the adult users as well. Anything
that's not them. So anyway, Avi, that's a lot of the stuff. I think you set the stage for some of the individual topics that we kind of want to explore here, a little bit, and to also explain to people how confusing, and this is my interpretation, and maybe you can confirm or deny, or make sure that we're on the correct page before moving forward. But and we've talked about this before when it comes to testing for cannabis, such as the cannabinoid composition, stuff like that, which some people call potency, which I think is kind of a misnomer, but there is not a universal method or standard that is mandated across the board, and there are people that may use different methods, different standards, and still have a scientifically sound process, but have a completely different number assigned, valued to that THC percentage or composition of other things.
Well, there is a real number. There is an accurate, actual number that, the percentage that's actually in the products. And labs, you're right, there is no standardized method yet. They're starting to standardize the requirements of methods. The methods have to be a certain percent standard deviation, have to be, have to meet accuracy and precision requirements. And so that's good, and it's coming along. But labs, what really happens is because potency is so, or cannabinoid THC percentage is so related to the price and selling, it's what people pay for. It has a very corrupting effect when, labs can just give you higher numbers because that's good for their business. It's good for your business, at least in the very, very short term, unless you get a recall, which that it's just, there's not, that's what the real problem is that it's not like they're trying to get the number right. they and it's really well known that it's really just not the right number, and it has a corrupting effect on the entire industry, because a lot of a lot of the growers just want to do a good job, but they feel that they have to use these labs for higher numbers just to compete. And it's not really a question of labs just using different methods, getting different numbers. If that was the case, every lab could just invent whatever method and gives them, 50% on every flower and still say it's legitimate in some way. But the fact is there's a right number, and labs have to be within a certain percentage of that number consistently to be a professional, ethical lab. And unfortunately, that's not the goal in many cases right now.
Okay. Well, that sets me straight a little bit then, because that's not exactly how I thought about it. But now I'm glad that I know that is how it is, because I thought by the way some places were presenting like a particular method, would mean that because we're not mandated to do it in a particular way, we'll assign, these values to this data here and say, we can do this consistently and have these, outcomes. So when you say THC inflation, how is that generally achieved, or how is that? Does that show up then? Because if you know that you've done it correctly, and you see
the
something
numbers combines delta 9 and delta 8 in order to artificially get a higher THC number than other people would deliver.
Well, it's just an artificially high number for THC. In the flower, it's usually THCA and delta 9 THC. And there's really many ways to do it. When you work in a lab, there's, if we're trying to do everything right, every day, be as accurate as we humanly possibly can. And that's a hard job. And if you want to bias your method to produce, higher numbers, it's very easy to do that in a technical perspective, whether, when you're running a method, when you're weighing things up, when you're adding solvents, when you're doing what we call calibration curves, which tell the machine how much is in there when you're injecting an unknown amount. There's a lot of little ways to do it and really never get caught. So it's really up to the labs to determine how accurate they are. And it's a hard job to be accurate, so you got to really try. And if you want to inflate, it's actually easier. It's easier to inflate everything and just have really high numbers all the time than to be accurate for a lab. And when you start doing that, you actually do really well as a lab. You start getting more and more business, and unfortunately, it has a corrupting effect. Labs get in the business sometime and want to do a good job, and this starts happening, and they feel they have to compete with potency inflation, so they start to inflate their numbers as well. And a big part of the problem is lack of effective enforcement. And I think even when it's obvious, we're trying to educate the consumers to really protect themselves, because it doesn't seem like anyone else is really doing it, able to step in, unambiguously determine that a lab is providing inflated potencies and then do something about it to protect consumers. Doesn't seem to be happening in a regulatory sense. So what Steadfast is trying to do is educate, it's like one person at a time to, this is not, first of all, if you're focusing on potency, probably not going to be as satisfied as you would be if you were looking at the terpenes and the entourage effect and the bigger picture. But also right now in this market, you can't even trust the number. So you're focusing on a number that's not even real. And that's the message we're trying to get out. And unfortunately, it's not in other industries that I've been in with testing, all the labs are pretty much the same. They have the same data, A, B, C, D labs. They all doing the same thing. Very different in this industry. And it's not by accident. I mean, these labs, they're what they're doing, and they're doing very well financially.
So let me just break it down for folks who might have not really following the conversation here. The higher the THC number is on your cannabis, the more marketable it is, the more likely you are to sell it, the higher dollar value you can get for it. And the arbiter of what your THC value is the lab. And if you have one lab that's giving artificially high THC numbers, which generates more money for the individual company, then that lab gets favored by the industry, and then they become dominant. We had one lab here that recently had a recall. A single lab with only 2 locations in the entire state of Michigan dominated 60% of the market. That's or more, and that's a perversion of the system. I mean, Avi, that's the literal example of what you've been saying, right? Isn't that true?
Really, and the consumers are the ones that are damaged every day, and it's a very large scale. Like you said, like it's not just in Michigan either. It's across the entire country. I would even say in Michigan we have regulators, and I get the impression they're trying hard to do something about it and are kind of unable to do something about it. But in other states, it's even worse. It's much worse even in some states. So it's a really big problem, and I really appreciate you guys having this forum and talking about these issues.
Avi, I think you already answered my question. As an expert or as somebody who has a scientific background in other industries, right? Do you have confidence? Do you have confidence in where Michigan is at, which I think you've already answered? Do you have confidence in where Michigan is going? I mean, this is it's voodoo science for some of these folks at the expense of sick people, and it just doesn't sit right with me.
Well, that's why we're here. I mean, we have hope that, yes, over time it will change. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of change, and it's frustrating, but it motivates us to go out there and spread the word as much as we can. And it's really not hidden in the industry. People know, if you don't get the numbers you want, where to go. But amongst consumers, it's still this hidden thing that no one seems to be too aware of. And so we're really trying to figure out ways to kind of make it more known, like these big, actions that when they eventually do come, kind of wake people up. It's like, oh, what's going on there? But it's just such a massive scale of the potency inflation. Like, people are spending more money as we speak across a whole country for something that's got the unrepresentative label on it.
Right. So it's got an unrepresentative label, and that's in and of itself the reality of how that works. We talk out here all the time that label in and of itself isn't something that should be relied on as much as it is to give it that much value.
Certainly, we know
we
hope
that the safety data was accurate, and it's not, unfortunately, especially when it comes to microbial testing. We see labs that very rarely detect mold in anything, and then labs that are doing the best they can to be accurate have much higher fail rates, and that doesn't help you as a lab in this business. It doesn't help at all.
Avi, during the Viridis trial or hearing rather, the Marijuana Regulatory Agency, which is what they were called at that time, gave testimony that Viridis actually had a history of passing cannabis samples that other places had failed. So
that was the red flag.
Right. Consistently, their lead science officer, Claire, and I forget her last name, said that consistently they saw cases where the same batch was tested in one place, failed, and then went to Viridis and tested and passed. So there's real world examples of what you're talking about. It's not just an angry industry member. There's reality behind what you're saying.
Well, what about, Avi, something like we talk about, like a lot of these toxins that are left behind for people that are remediating and microwaving bud just to get it to pass, these kind of outside factors that nobody's even talking about. So yeah, the bud might not have mold, but what about these toxins that could be lingering in the flower just because they want to get it to pass, to get it to market? It's seedy.
The state actually did. The rules are migrating, and they have a long way to go. I think recently they updated the rules so that if you were remediating something, so different types of mold can form these chemicals that are not living chemicals. They stick around after you remediate, called mycotoxins, and those can be very poisonous. And with the mycotoxin testing, they're now requiring that if you remediate something that failed for aspergillus. So you're absolutely right, and hopefully that the rules getting better will continue to address those kinds of issues. But that's the whole thing. Like with molds, you can have these high levels, and a lot of people won't notice. It may not even care. But there are people that are affected in a big way, and it can really harm their health. And when they go to buy it at the store, it says it's been tested, and they're assuming it's safe, when unfortunately that's not the reality in every country.
You hear the big argument too from a lot of these people, from these remediation folks and people that are advocating for remediation, that the flower becomes moldy after the fact. After it leaves our lab, we have no control over that. Is that a theory that you buy into as well, or?
We see what we see in the industry is what we see, and we see people handling it very carefully. The transport vans are climate controlled. They're not, they're usually in sealed containers all the way to sale in most cases. It's not impossible, but what we see is cannabis that has what we call water activity. It's how much water is available in the material for microbial growth. When it's below 0.7 or so, mold dies off over time. So what you'd really expect to see is mold levels over time going down. And we've seen that. We've created mixtures of powders of cannabis, which we call a matrix, and we've studied those over time. And in fact, the mold levels do go down over time and not up unless you have bad storage. So it's not untrue that if you spray the cannabis with water or somehow moisture is introduced again, it can start growing. It will grow more mold and the mold will increase. But as a general thing, like if there's some really systematic thing found, I would definitely question that that's the real reason.
When the packaging, of course, after it's tested and approved, then it's packaged. And it's in the packaging stage, I think, where the possibility for contamination comes in. One of the arguments laboratories have made is just what Anton was saying. A lab report is just a snapshot in time, just a report about what it existed like on one particular date. I have cannabis joints here from a variety of different regulated market sources. Some of them were on the shelf for 6 to 8 months before I got them gifted to me or before I paid for them. Some of them just 2 or 3. We know THC degrades over time, but what's clear to us as a consumer is that that label may have been reflective of what the state of that cannabis was at that moment. But the time that's passed since then, it most certainly has affected things like terpene quantity. THC degrades over time, so sometimes THC percentage levels will be lower too. That's one of the reasons why some people are skeptical of those labels. I mean, you would back that up with science, right?
We all probably smoked some old weed and it doesn't taste as good. I think that's the main thing. Yeah. THC, the cannabinoids themselves are pretty stable. And as far as the safety tests go, you're not contaminating your bag with pesticides or metals. Those aren't going to change. And with microbials, like I said, the mold counts go down over time as long as it's dry.
I think Spartan brings up a good point here too. What might be misleading about that representative sample, even though it might be taken from around the batch and and eventually homogenized and brought down and and that kind of stuff, across a 50-pound amount, there could be many different combinations of the things or compositions of the cannabinoid profile or things like that. There could be a varying degree of THC percentage between one side of that crop to that harvest to the other.
I would sample.
It's an agricultural product. It's heterogeneous, like anything else. And we do a random sampling for that very reason, and it's required in Michigan. In other states, they don't even require that, and so really, the lab samples provided. Here you go, kind of thing. And
the most optimal piece of cannabis they have.
Yeah, it could be the same thing over and over. Who knows what it is? But there's no real way to kind of say that this test is representative of this batch. In Michigan, we're better than that. We do random sampling. I can't speak for what other labs do and the care they take to really make sure it's representative, but it can be done. It's not going to be perfect. Like if you go back, several days in a row, you'll have some variation, but it should be a very kind of tight data set if you do that.
So to confirm, Richard, here, if you have material in an airtight package, does that slow down degradation?
Absolutely. I mean, anything you do to kind of maintain, especially the terpenes in there, seal it up. I even kept it in the freezer. Sometimes I don't know if that's really how effective those things are, but I mean, you want to keep it sealed up. The main thing is keep it dry, and it'll last a long time.
In our industry, we've talked for a long time about protecting it from sunlight too. That you want to keep it in a dark container, a shielded jar. We sometimes refer to it as, in order to stop, light from having an effect on that too. That's a correct assumption, right?
Yeah. So light will decarboxylate just like heat. So even if it's in a freezer with sunlight or light hitting it, it will slowly decarboxylate. Not necessarily getting weaker, but it's turning in delta 9, and certainly the terpene profile is affected over time.
So, Anton, you had a question? I'm sorry, you got kind of bumped there.
No, I was going to say the other kind of theory I hear from people when we talk about testing is Michigan's testing is it's so much more over the top than, say, our food process, that when you go into the grocery store, and we're not afraid to eat a lot of the foods that haven't gone under, a fraction of the testing that our cannabis has undergone, that why are we getting so bent out of shape about remediation and those types of processes? Is there a comparison to be made there?
We're not the health and medical people, so we don't really know. What we see is that, yeah, Michigan is strict, and cannabis in general, they have strict rules. We don't know if they're, right or wrong, but, with the bad numbers out there, it's like, why even have it? Why even have that limit if people are just way beyond it and still passing it? I don't really know. And in the pesticide side, a lot of those are unknown, like the long-term, they're newer pesticides. And so they just really give you the limit, like the lowest amount. They don't want any in there. And so they give you really the lowest amount that you can detect reliably in the best equipment that you can get.
Well, I was around when they drafted the MMFLA testing regs, and I can tell you that Clint Kesto was the representative who entered that bill into the legislature, and it was written by industry and included everything they possibly could throw in there, the kitchen sink, because at that particular time they had control of the Republican Party essentially for this, and they got what they wanted. The regs here in Michigan are stricter than they are in almost any other state. Aspergillus is one of those tricky things that oftentimes is pointed to as proof of cannabis's harmful effect. In fact, it's oftentimes cited one death from California for an Aspergillus exposure. Avi, are you familiar with any other Michigan exposures or dangers from Aspergillus or anything like that?
I haven't heard, but Aspergillus is one. You don't want that in your weed, and we test for it here. And hopefully, labs are doing a good job on that for everyone's safety. And that's really, I think, when the states stepped in, it seemed like that's what they cared about. It's hard to deny there's a lot of moldy weed or potency inflation out there. Didn't seem to bring any real action from the state. But when people started, it was obvious there's Aspergillus contaminated stuff out there. That's when it seemed they finally took an action on that. However effective it may.
So, while it's true that the THC number might not mean very much, or that having certain levels of molds might not affect most people, a consumer buying something from the commercial market should have confidence that the product that they're buying is as described and is been vetted because it was mass produced. I mean, it's different than a small caregiver garden where the patient has access to determine if they like the practices of that caregiver, and where they do have access to testing if they want to take it that far and get more information on their harvest and that kind of stuff. So regardless of whether or not cannabis is known to really hurt people with those molds and stuff like that, or the percentage really matters, the consumer should be getting accurate information. That's how the system is supposed to work. And if it doesn't, there's a problem.
There's a truth in labeling law also. And I think that the reality is, when you look at some of these labels, if what they're telling you is the truth, some of that's pretty interesting, that a joint sits for 6 or 8 months on a shelf. And you got to think that something happens to that weed over 6 or 8 months. And it may not be harmful, but it may not be a positive thing either.
I think Rick's responsible for the more stricter rules that are out there.
Carrie believes so. Right. Actually, she forgets though that in 2016, I was actually the voice in the committee room saying these are too strict. You're inhibiting our industry, and you're going to make it difficult for the average guy to get into it, because the testing standards are so high that one failed crop could sink a small businessman. And when we're trying to help caregivers get into the new system that they proposed for the MMFLA, one of the concerns we had was that they were making it too exclusive. So when I argued against some of these strict standards, it's not that I wanted less healthy cannabis out in the marketplace. First of all, I don't believe that we have unhealthy cannabis out in the marketplace. I don't see any illnesses as evidence of it. So therefore, I must conclude that there isn't any problem. But the fact is, we fought hard to get some of those things taken out, or to get them lessened. But But that's okay. Everybody has selective memory, and when you hate somebody as much as she hates me, it's cool.
What does any of it matter if they just disregard and put their own damn numbers in there anyways?
This is one of the public relations issues with the testing industry itself. Several of our commenters today have said, why do we need testing anyway? I smoke a lot of cannabis and don't have any illnesses. I just basically said it myself as well. But clearly, it's mandated by law, as well as there's, pesticides and things like that we have to watch out for on a commercial basis.
Mass produced as opposed to the small garden. Right.
Someone's more likely to use pesticides on a larger level than they are on a smaller level, because if you have an inexpensive solution to a really major problem that's going to save you millions of dollars of your crop, you're probably likely to bend the rules a little bit and use that solution, as opposed to a small garden person who, is probably not going that direction. Do you find, Avi, pesticide residue often in the samples that you test?
Actually, no. In the regulated market, it's very rare. Actually, sometimes from outdoor crops, it's incidental pesticide. We actually did see more when the caregivers were testing in those days. I think people used pesticides and they didn't think about it because it wasn't regulated, and some of those things stick around for generations. And,
if you read the labels on some of those things, you would think that it was perfectly okay anyway,
Yeah, and caregivers are used to not having a list of regs to follow because really there aren't any. So when we start putting the regular regulations on people who've never had regs before, they're probably going to stumble a little bit. Go ahead, Adam.
When I was in the grow shop business, I will tell you that people would come in and ask for products that you could not use on smokable flowers. And these were potheads coming in asking for this. I know what a pothead looks like. I know what a guy smells like when he left his grow room and came into my grow shop. And I know exactly what he's doing. And the reality is that these cats would buy all kinds of things, and if they could get it. And I think that's up to be honest, I always thought that was on the grow shop. If you don't want to sell poisons for people to use, don't sell it. Don't put it in the marketplace, because they will buy it. Now, the regulated market, ain't nobody going to risk losing a crop or batching out because they used a pesticide that's illegal when they can use a pesticide that's legal. I mean, they're not doing that stuff.
So I want to interject really quick, though. Paul Tylenda, Attorney Paul Tylenda has joined us. Go ahead, Brent.
But Avi, a bad pesticide test, you can't recover from that, right? It's one and done on that, isn't it true?
No, that's old. That was the original rule. If you fail for pesticide, no remediation. You had to be destroyed. But now you can remediate or test it again. And, pesticides will go away over time. I guess in theory, if you leave some contaminated stuff out in the sun long enough, you'll break those pesticides down. So, no. So now there are ways to remediate it. It's hard from flour. Usually it's remediated in the processing of oils and things like that.
Well, you talked about the evolution of the regulations regarding cannabis testing. There's a proof statement right there of an evolution too. I remember when batch sizes were much smaller, and now they're up to 50 pounds to make the price of testing easier for retailers or for cultivators to bear. We've really seen some changes, right, Avi?
Yeah, the rules have changed quite a bit, and they do kind of change seemingly in a lumpy way, but there's been some recent changes that were major. They took a lot of these. They used to give us this instruction book that we followed as like the law. We're like, these are the instructions from the MRA, and we got to do it. And then I guess they found out later that those are not really enforceable, and those are just suggestions. And so now they took those rules and try and run them into the actual law. And so there's all these little changes that have been happening really across the board. So not much is really the same as it was early on, and hopefully it continues to change, because it seems to me it's got a long way to go.
Now, those changes are done through the changes in the admin rules, which are a little bit different than the changes that we have talked about here during the course of our show, which have been primarily legislative changes. And the Cannabis Regulatory Agency can legitimately change the admin rules as long as they provide proper notice, right?
Yeah, there's a process I'm not really that familiar with, but there's a process to do it with public comment and the whole law writing process. And that's where I guess the instruction book didn't stand up to muster, as it didn't have all those steps.
But again, these are people who don't understand cannabis, who are getting involved, and who are making rules for people who do understand it, who live, breathe, and smoke it. And these people do none of that. So, they've come a long way. I'm pretty impressed with what's happened in Michigan. They figured out they had to make some changes, and they've made some, and they know there's a lot more that needs to be done, and we all know that.
How would somebody identify a product that is likely not accurate?
Can't.
I mean, if you go home and you see some really high number and then you smoke it and you just know it's not, I mean, that's one way to do it. A lot of people are dissatisfied with things when they shop by potency only. I recommend people used to shop with their nose, and I think we're more satisfied with what they got in those days.
You just said a lot of people are dissatisfied when they go shopping for THC potency only. I think that's the quote of the day right there. I will also note, I think the MRE requires a retest on everything over 27%, Avi. Would that be true?
I don't know if there's like an actual number, but they do watch the labs, and when they think something has been inflated, they'll ask you to repeat it. So let's say Steadfast has something high. They say, we think that's too high. Retest it, Steadfast. So we retest it ourselves and report the number again. So it's really just you're checking your and I guess if it happens a lot, it becomes a pain because you got to tie up your equipment doing all these retests, and that could be but it doesn't seem like it's really nothing that's been done really so far has been effective in stopping the behavior.
So let's let Paul Tylenda, attorney in front of the show, in. I know I cut him off in the middle of asking a question. I apologize, Paul.
Not at all, Rick. Anytime. If anybody can cut me off, it's you, buddy. But obviously, a couple questions, actually. One is I wanted to know that in terms of moving away from, like, let's say THC alone as one of like the main, let's say, back label indicators on cannabis products in the retail market, do you see that it will be the retailers or the growers that want to have more information printed on the back label to get more terpene information, to get more of, let's just say, less THC content only information on the back labels? Or do you see that coming from Lara itself, or do you see that just being a client by client who wants that information on their product versus others who could care less?
So from my perspective, we want to inform people. We want consumers to ask for their certificates of analysis and look at the data. Sometimes terpenes weren't even measured on a lot of products. But we try, and it's hard. We try and encourage people to look for that information. Sometimes you go to the provisioning center and bud tenders don't even know how to access that information. So that's a problem. We wish there was more transparency on the data and it was more easily accessed. I don't think Lara will require more things like terpenes. It's not necessarily a safety issue. I don't really know what they're going to do though, but we think it's very smart for retailers to promote their products in a better way that'll satisfy consumers in a more reliable way by looking at the terpene profiles and putting them on the labels. We would love it. And it's unfortunate right now that there's just kind of a lack of information.
Well, let me jump onto that too, is that in terms of the information, let's say what you're talking about is the information available on the cannabis product itself that lets the consumer know what the contents are and what the terpene, what the full profile is. On the consumer side of that, I go back to like the question I always have when the terpene conversation comes up is that how do you educate the regular consumer about this? How do we go from what, let's just say, maybe has just taken hold of it in the general consumer market, which is the understanding of the distinction between the indicas and the sativas, and the way that they're explained simply to, let's say, the older generation or to the newcomers that says, okay, well, here's your daytime, here's your nighttime, here's your up, here's your down, here's if you want sleep, you take this. If you want a little concentration during the day, you take this. And it's been neatly packaged. And easily conveyed so that the general public understands. It says, hey, high THC gets me high. Indica or sativa is awake or asleep, right? Indica, couch, and sativa is all day long type of, let's say, oversimplification of where we've come from in cannabis. So how, and I guess I pose this to all, is that how do we best explain in just the simplest terms to the general consuming public the distinctions and the values, and more importantly, how to define what the effect they're looking for out of those 6, 7, 8 categories of terpenes, that they would understand? Because again, I think that the educational side of it is to say, hey, this, I go to buy cannabis and they tell me, here are all these terpenes and here are all these profiles, and it doesn't mean much to me, in the same way that sometimes red wine just tastes good or it doesn't. I don't need to know its history or its legacy. How do we get to that education point, and who's responsible for that?
Well, I'll be honest with you. As a retail specialist, I can tell you that signage inside a store that the bud tenders are familiar with is the easiest way for you to convey scientific messages. It's the easiest way for you to convey sale information or product details. You have to have something right there. So if you had a sign that broke down individual terpenes with their projected effects, realizing, of course, that everybody's body is a little bit different and limonene might not affect us all equally, but generalize those effects. And then you have educated bud tenders who can translate that information into their stock situation. Which one has, linalool, which one's got the pinene, and then you can present cannabis at that point. But what we're really talking about is retraining literally millions of Michigan consumers on buying cannabis a different way. And I think we need to be realistic about the expectation there, that even though we have all the science behind us and we're very encouraged and enthused about this, there's a percentage of the public that's going to take a while to absorb this information, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and to think, it's taken us, quite a while, a handful of years, to get to a point where we do understand indica, sativa, and that, higher is supposed to mean how much more stoned you get, at least in the commercial market, is what they're trying to say. But the equating to, and when Rick, when you talk about it, you make me go back to like 2010, right? When you're having that patient conversation with what ails you, and this is what we have, and take your pick.
And it was all based on strain name. That's all we had to go by at that time. And we know that oftentimes strain names were fungible. Avi's laughing. He knows. He was around back then. Before testing, the only thing you could do to gauge was, what was the title of it? Did it have the name Hawaiian in it? Did it have Kush in it? Did it have OG in the title? Because those are very marketable things. And we used the title to manipulate product and its marketability in the same way that THC numbers are being used now, I think.
And I think that provisioning centers have a real opportunity to differentiate themselves, because if they're able to kind of boil this information down, in a more scientific way than indica, sativa, strain name, they're gonna end up with more satisfied consumers.
Well, if you have more information to offer the consumer, and the consumer can match up what's consistently working with, especially those who are a little bit more sensitive. So if that terpene and whatever else other information might be pertinent, some flavonoids or something might deem down the road, this whole bigger picture needs to be there, in order to, make this good for somebody. But a quick way that I tell, I kind of encapsulate it as a way to move people away from those kind of misnomers about sativa, indica. It's just that the components in the plant work synergistically, and when those things come together with the individual's unique system, that's when we know what the effect is. And for those who are more sensitive, you can start trying to seek out which things are more consistently bringing those effects, and then try to emulate that as much as possible with more information.
Right.
Many of us, like myself, I think most, I can work with a lot of things, a lot of different types, a lot of forms, a lot of delivery methods, a lot of those at once. I like
THC whore. Yeah, right.
But some people really need to figure out, what and when to use it, and how, and that kind of stuff. And, to have more information is the best way to help people out with that.
I kind of like a color coding system. I feel like if you had limonene, something with limonene and it had a yellow label on it, or something with pinene had a green label on it, and you kind of break it down so you've got it to where you're putting things like by terpene, but something that the average
stripes, right?
the
Little color
average
stripes in the corner.
consumer can recognize. Instead of seeing indica sativa, now they're correlating these colors. With
You'll
what
see
they're
a combination though. There's a transition taking place in some respects. You'll see like the major 2, 3, 4 terpenes included along with some information that might also say indica or sativa hybrid or something.
Rare
like that.
Cannabis is known for that. Their packaging, especially on pre-rolls and things like that, is very, very helpful as far as breaking down all the terps. Avi, which companies do you? I'm sorry. Go ahead, please.
I know out west in California, they're really moving towards that as a traditional display in the same way that we would display, style, type, and THC content. And the frustrating part is that these signs would have the name of the strain, and then they would have the 4 categories of terpenes, and a lot of times they wouldn't all be filled in. So it wasn't like you see on some descriptions where you get CBD, CBN, and you get some zero description. It's still there rather than just left blank. Whereas out there, you might get a really high terpene profile on 1 or 2, and the other 2 don't exist. And it's unfair. I think it's kind of unfair to the consumer to leave it blank rather than just say, okay, there's 0, so at least you're expecting there.
I mean, what's a typical terpene percentage? I'm hearing 4% terps is a really high percent for some of what we're doing with here. What's your typical how terpene?
Actually, we recently did this. One of our clients asked they wanted their average compared to like our historical average. We looked at it, and the average over it's over 5,000 samples was, I think, about 1.4, 1.5%. And there's a lot of companies that'll do consistently 2.5, 3+%. That we also have. So it's a wide range. But yeah, if you're getting consistently above 2, you're doing better than most.
And when we see that, is there the most common terp that's typically found in cannabis? Is there something that stands out as being more common than others?
I think beta-carotene is in every cannabis plant we've ever tested. I think.
And is that the terpene that's also found like in black pepper or something?
Yes, I believe that's the one. Limonene is very common. Myrcene, I would probably put those are the top 3, are very common and in most strains for sure. Limonene, myrcene, and myrcene's been studied, and they evidence is that it enhances the effect of THC. So that's a good one you want to look out for.
Yeah, it's in mango. That's why there's a connection.
When we juice raw cannabis plants, which I advise everybody to try and to do as regularly as you can because it is so wonderful for your body. Mango, when added to the raw cannabis juice, functions as a director, they call it, helps to enhance the experience that you have with that in the healing.
Also, it makes it taste a lot better.
I don't
because
like
it's kind of bitter by itself. But the raw juice is awesome. And personally, and I'm not sure if everybody has this experience, but when I have some of the raw juice and I smoke, I have to stop a few hits in because I'm what I call the high school stony. I get really high really fast because of whatever the juice set the stage for. As soon as I start, bringing in the real stuff. And but otherwise, I mean, I could smoke joints all day long. It's not that necessarily proud of that. It's just the truth. I mean, it's function. Some saturation point, and I'm sure, and I'm just continuing to smoke just to out of habit at that point. But
with myrcene, I know that's it's really important that the grower get their environment right because it off gases at such a low temperature that if they're not paying attention to their environment, I mean, you lose a lot of that terpene quality real quick. So that's another thing that just goes into the whole artwork and the craft of learning how to cultivate on a large scale to where you can grow a consistent product that's gonna have these terpenes present. I mean, it's a whole craft.
And that can easily be done in a cultivation setting as far as breaking your temperature constraints. If you have an AC unit goes down, or we have one of those Michigan weeks where we're 100 degrees for 6 days in a row, even if you're indoors, it's going to put a strain on your scenario. new lights. There's just a number of different ways that you can actually overachieve your heat target. And as you mentioned, once you've destroyed those terps in that particular plant, they're not regenerating that. So,
one thing I was going to mention earlier, and I forgot to, but it could be kind of relative here. I've seen in some of the dispensaries when there's certain, however they want to describe it, somebody, the different levels, the different grades, the different evaluations of values of cannabis, whatever, low shelf, top shelf, whatever. There's oftentimes representatives of higher and lower THC counts within each of those categories. Even though people pay more for higher THC stuff on the market, there's still people still distinguish, value based on so many other factors that it even ends up on the shelves of the stores like that.
See that more and more now, and I think I attribute it to people learning more. It's not all about THC, and hopefully some people are catching on, and that's what we're starting to see. I think in the early days it was just THC, low, medium, high, and top shelf was all just THC based. But now people are putting their really best weed on the top shelf.
I'll tell you this, that brand loyalty nowadays is something that's coming into the marketplace. I was at one of the retailers recently, and I looked at their top shelf, and the Backpack Boys had a variety of, that's all there was. You couldn't find it anywhere other than top shelf. It was a recognized, really quality thing. And they had some THC levels down in the 19 and 20%. And typically for top shelf cannabis, you would see a much larger THC number at 27, 28, 29, over 30 for top shelf, just because that they're demanding a top dollar for it. But the Backpack Boys seem to move pretty quickly because they had such a great reputation as a brand. And speaking of that, Steadfast, I mean, when we go to a particular retailer, how can we be assured that Steadfast is the lab that tested our cannabis?
Ask for Steadfast. Ask for Steadfast tested products, and you can rest assured the number's accurate and it's a safe product.
Is there a way to search through someone's store inventory through the metric in order to identify what's Steadfast and what isn't?
It's not the easiest thing to do. A lot of the bartenders are agnostic about the labs, and they may not know which, and they might actually have to start.
It's on the label, though, right?
It is on the label.
You can see the label. You can
check it. You can check it yourself. And absolutely, our best advice for consumers now, even more importantly than knowing the brands, is knowing the labs. Mm-hmm. And you can tell a lot about the brands by what labs they're testing with.
Truth. And so, which brands traditionally do you work with, if you're willing to give you?
You started asking that question, and I thought about it, and I just thought I better not, because it's quite a number of them, and if I forget one or two, it's not going to be great.
I got you. No, okay.
Well, we
thank
tested
you.
some of the biggest and some of the not only the biggest, but a lot of the craft smaller guys as well. We've been around since 2015. We're a supporter of testing, and we're all about safety, and we want everybody to test. And we really are committed to our customers' success, because that's how we're going to succeed too.
Right. And people are saying that the lab is listed on the metric label, and of course that's true. But what we're saying is, when you're a retailer and you have a whole shelf of product, you might know company names, but you don't know which lab is responsible for which. So to flip over each one of those prepackaged 8s to see who has tested it would be quite a challenge for most of the bud tenders. And frankly, they just can't be bothered. You know what I mean? Oh. So,
but it is important. It is important to know that the numbers are accurate, and there are good labs. It's not just Steadfast that are trying their best day in and day out to provide accuracy.
Let me ask this, and Rick, you might have seen some of this, and I'm going to start Avi of how much you would see this, but with the piggybacking on what Jamie was talking about, how you're seeing and we're talking about how you're seeing, let's say, top shelf products that have what we would consider lower end THC numbers. I'm seeing things, and I'm hearing parts of things from growers where the demand for cannabis isn't so much that all cannabis has to kick your ass. Sometimes you want a nice, easy smoke where you just kind of want the smoke and you want just a little bit, versus, a 28% kind of like, I forget where I am and why I'm here and what I'm doing type of, 3-hour trip to the grocery store kind of joints, right? Because sometimes you just need to kind of, let's just say, take the edge off the day with 16, 17%, something that might, just soften the day up a little bit. I'm starting to see that more out of the the connoisseur smokers that aren't smoking, one strain a day. They might smoke 3 or 4 different ones because they, serve different purposes at different points in the day. Are you seeing that anymore, like on a public level, retail level, where like the consumer is starting to, let's say, not just need a shot of whiskey every time, but might just want to have a beer?
People are selecting the 0.7 gram pre-roll joints as opposed to the full 1 gram pre-roll joint. So when they do this, oftentimes, you save $1 or so. But the fact is, if you're smoking a regular joint and you're leaving a third of it in the ashtray, you're paying for a third of stuff that you weren't really using before. So if you're going with a 0.7 instead of a whole 1 grammer, that's one of the ways where people are individually titrating their particular dose. But to be honest with you, I couldn't educatedly answer that question because I'm not the person that actually does the retail transaction. I just observe and listen to conversation. So to be honest, I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question. But the rise of the 0.7 gram pre-roll, I think, indicates that people are looking for that. Plus, Darren McCarty has a line in his product which is for the brand new smoker that has that 14 to 15% THC level, and it advertises that proudly as the prominent feature, not so stony kind of a product, and those are successful.
So while we talk about it like that, I mean, some things at 14% will kick your ass all over the place. Much more than something at 25% will. So those things don't matter. If you break down, I want to get higher or low, they don't really apply. That's one of the issues that we're talking about.
But you're talking about the science of it, and I'm talking about the marketing that's being done.
Right on. No, that's exactly right. Sorry, I didn't mean to clash that. I just kind of, like for example, when Paul was talking about it, maybe that's more like, that's commonly, kind of associated with those ranges of THC numbers would be like how generally high you get or how long you're high or something. There is no real like direct causation, between those things.
No, I think that's how it's marketed.
I think that even carries over into like the concentrate world. I've had times where I'll take a dab and I'm not really getting much out of it. And I can fire up a joint with, something like, Jamie, what you're talking about, 17, 18, 19. And, it's off to the races. So it's how your body processes it. It's how I don't know how it works.
That's what you expect from it sometimes, based on your
understanding
of, right.
That's really where the naming of cannabis strains has to become more conventional. When, you've got Blue Dream that comes from 3 different people that has completely different profiles, what you're really doing is misleading the customers as to whether or not Blue Dream is good for them. And Avi, maybe you can discuss this a little bit. There's been some talk on a national basis about developing a DNA database that's associated with individual strains. I think primarily because business persons want to be able to patent or trademark those particular strains. But that would be helpful in the industry in order to straighten out some of these misconceptions. Don't you think?
Yeah, and I mean, over time, the indica versus sativa becomes kind of more and more meaningless because it's all clouded. There's not really a lot of scientific data behind it. There was a company that did that, and they had their universe, which showed the relationship between all the strains, and it was really cool. But I think that they got into trouble because they were trying to do, patent your strain kind of thing. So you got to be really careful with the information about doing that and kind of really know who's doing the testing. But I think we'll see more and more of it. We'll see more and more people doing real classification of cannabis and figuring out what all the relationships are between the different strains and where this one came from, this continent and that. I think it's getting better, but it's still kind of in a very, very kind of prehistoric state.
Go ahead, Anton.
I was going to say, I even wonder when we're talking, now we're getting into genetic profiles, how accurate even that would be. Because when we say Blue Dream, well, first of all, there could be thousands of phenos of Blue Dream out there. And then if we take it a step further and we narrow it down to one specific phenotype of Blue Dream, if you take that pheno and you have 5 different growers grow it out, you're going to get 5 different products, right? Because everybody does something a little bit different. That terpene profile may be just a tad different. So really, I think it's get it as accurate as we can, but it's never going to be exact.
Well, it's like DNA typing of human beings. I mean, we all share the same common genes, and then there are some variable genes. So if you're looking at the genetics, those 5 cultivars of Blue Dream. By the way, I'm using cultivars as opposed to strains. Ooh, I feel good about me. So the 5 different cultivars, they'll still have ideally anyway. They should all have the same commonalities, even though they're expressing individual traits based on their DNA variability. So, but what I wanted to say before, I'll tell you, there's estimates on a national basis that in states with legalized cannabis programs, up to 50% of adults use cannabis at some point during a calendar year. If that's the case, we have 3.5 million Michiganders to educate as far as how to purchase properly on cannabis. And again, I think having a realistic expectation that it's going to take a while for people to adopt those things that we have already come to mentally understand as common when it comes to people. So a consistent educational campaign in order to change the way people buy. But there's a lot of resistance. I mean, corporate entities love having an advantage over another one, and having a THC number that's artificially inflated directly translates to a monetary corporate advantage. Avi, that's what we started this whole conversation with, right? Talking about how certain particular labs perhaps are ginning up the numbers in order to create a greater marketability for some otherwise moderate mids cannabis, as we would like to call it.
Yeah, but I think it also can bite them in the backside because, they're putting these fake numbers out there. People are buying it and then they're not satisfied with it. They know, like, all right, well, if that was 30%, my caregiver is growing 40, I mean, they know people figure it out. And it's, if someone is not satisfied, they're not going to buy that brand again. So, I mean, yeah, it's a short-term thing. It seems it's obviously very lucrative for those participating in that. But I think over the long term, the brands, they're not knowing what their real data is. How do they know how to keep getting better? How do they know what strains they want to keep, which ones they don't? They don't know because they don't have accurate data. The folks using accurate labs may not have all these inflated numbers right now and making all this money off the consumer wrongly, but over time, they're going to have better products.
Yeah. And that's why I think we talked about brand identity earlier a little bit too. If somebody consistently tests with Steadfast and you get consistent numbers from there and people are consistently impressed with the cannabis, then that brand name becomes their go-to, and Steadfast becomes a lab that they're familiar with that. So clearly there's a big advantage to being connected with people who produce really quality cannabis as a lab.
Absolutely. You definitely want to test. We definitely want to test for all the best. No doubt about it.
And you're available for statewide, just Lower Peninsula. What do you guys do?
We really go all over the state, mostly in the Detroit area, but we also go all over the place. We're typically probably within, I would say, 3 hours. We're somewhere within 3 hours every day of the week.
Now, because of the lab protocol, the lab itself has to send someone out to the facility itself to do that random sampling of the batch that we talked about earlier too. So that's kind of a limiting factor. So about 3 hours out from D is really what you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, we've done stuff in the UP where we had people staying over for the night, but it is a long day, when you're driving 3-4 hours, but it's routinely done. All the labs really compete on the whole state. We're not turning anyone down for, the distance.
And your capacity, you guys are doing great. You have wonderful equipment. And
so we started in 2015 with a real small 700 square foot lab, and we actually didn't even need the whole thing because in those days it was mostly potency testing, and we did other testing too, but it was mostly potency testing in those days. And we built a brand new state-of-the-art lab. I'd like to invite you guys and people in general to come visit in Hazel Park. Now we got 6,000 square feet. We've got all the best equipment and huge capacity. And we're actually training and hiring now to take advantage of it. We don't really have all the pieces in place to fully run our whole entire lab yet, but we're getting there.
Nice. And when people want to contact you, what's the best way for them to do that?
You can go to steadfastlabs.com, or you can find the contact information there. Give us a call, send us an email.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, certainly we'd love you to stay with the rest of the program if you don't mind. I'd really like to talk to Paul a little bit about this Detroit lawsuit, the lawsuit against the Detroit ordinance, since it's so fresh and recent. Anybody else have anything else for Avi before we try to switch gears here?
Well, I guess just generally before we kind of wrap, before we kind of move on too much, is there anything you want to make sure that you include before we move on? Any direction to website or anything else that you want to make sure people know about? And are you familiar and understanding of some of the stuff that's going on in localities and on the statewide level?
Absolutely. Check us out, steadfastlabs.com. Everybody, I kind of urge the consuming public to know your testing labs, learn about your testing labs. A little bit of research, you can figure out a lot about which ones are more trustworthy than others. And, good luck out there. It's a fraud situation buying cannabis in the regulated market or anywhere, quite frankly, these days.
Wonderful segment. Thank you, Avi. Again, please stay with the show. We only got a half an hour left. You can do that.
Happy to. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and feel free to jump in on the discussion. But I'm interested too in what Paul thinks about what's going on with Detroit. So, Rick, please.
Just for our viewers out of state that are not familiar with what we're talking about, the city of Detroit this is their second time around trying to license adult use cannabis retail operations. They previously licensed medical retail adult operations, and that's been working pretty well for them. There are 75 licenses issued in the city, although some of those licenses are apparently idle, as people were just paying the fees and waiting until adult use came around. So adult use comes around, but the city of Detroit puts in their ordinance several restrictions that make it seemingly unfair to those existing medical marijuana retailers. And gives favoritism to new applicants as opposed to rewarding people who have already been in the industry for a while. Paul's obviously pulling something up over there, so I'll give him a little bit more time. So the concern from businesses' perspective is that how do you choose which one of the 75 gets an adult use license and which doesn't? The number that the city of Detroit has chosen to award is only about 110 licenses for adult use centers. They could change that number to 150 easily, and that way they would give all of the existing 75 licensees an opportunity to participate, plus create 75 opportunities for new businesses from Detroiters. But they have chosen this very limited licensing scheme, and that's what's come under fire for this recent lawsuit, charging that the way that they're choosing winners and losers in the Detroit thing is prejudicial. The second thing to know about the Detroit ordinance is that it has severability, meaning that there are both limited and unlimited license types. The unlimited license types are cultivation centers, transport, testing. So licensing of those can go on because it's unlimited. As long as you meet the parameters defined by the ordinance for zoning, you can have as many of those centers as open as you wish. But retail operations, the Detroit Council has decided to limit to a finite number, and that's what's got them in trouble. Paul, how was my assessment of that?
Spot on. And you touched on some of the politics of the issue too, which is a control of sort of the who, what, and where. And I guess, and I had this conversation all too often, is that we understand what Detroit wants, right? We understand the spirit and the intent of what they're trying to accomplish, and they're trying to do so in a legal way. And that's the wrestling match between them and the bear right now, that they're losing. And I don't know, I guess they can't serve, they can't win both games, right? They can't both satisfy the law necessarily and truly get what they want. And the middle ground that they're trying to achieve isn't really the middle. It's really more of just stepping on their own toes and doing the same kind of things. And really it gets towards, again, with Detroit's intent, which is to say, we want to give back to Detroiters. We want to make sure that the neighborhood has input. We want to make sure that that the retail businesses in Detroit are appropriate for the neighborhoods and the city as a whole, which I don't think anybody's going to disagree with. But the way they're going about it and not allowing, let's say, the neighborhoods to control either through variances or through other feedback or through other simple allowances that aren't as mathematical as just, let's say, 1,000 feet from a liquor store, right? The reality of the marketplace liquor store was acknowledged several years ago, when the liquor store isn't just a liquor store, it's the community center. It's often the only place to get groceries, milk, and food and the like. So including that as a regulated use away from marijuana has no real corresponding interest for the government, but churches and schools and the like do, so they've really kind of moved from there. The important part of the Detroit lawsuit, which is to me, let's say, less academic than the first lawsuit, right? And the first lawsuit said, okay, this is essentially a economic preference issue, and you can't do that, right? That's called a constitutional issue and not a black and white language statutory conflict issue, which is lawsuit number 2. Lawsuit number 2 is essentially saying, well, the ordinance says that if you have a medical license, you wait in line, you can't apply for any licenses until 27, which that's in direct conflict ultimately with the MRTMA. And that's what I was trying to find, is the paragraph about how they can't really create additional requirements. And I think it's in section 27.956, talking about they can establish a physical location requirement, but can't impose qualifications that conflict with this act or the rules. And there's another run in here I was also looking for that I believe was raised early on, which essentially says that you can't create 2 zones, or you can't have a medical zone and a recreational zone, and you can't treat them separately, right? Because if you start to treat these similarly situated people separately, it's an overall equal protection issue. But in reality, there's this, they're affecting a punishment. There's a penalty in the application process for having an existing business, which I dare you to find an existing business owner that isn't going to say that the reason that these ordinances exist now is because of the hard work that we've done, and the reason that the businesses are here and maybe here is because of the hard work of the original.
Paul, we're having a real difficult time with your microphone. Can you move your microphone in some way?
Yeah, I think it's my bad.
Is that better?
Yes.
Aha! All right. I want my battery died.
Thank you.
But that's
The idea of this, you're a similarly situated entity that's being penalized from behind, right? And I think the city is going to say, well, you're not similarly situated because you are an existing business owner. This ordinance applies to fresh businesses. But I guess I have this feeling that they're going to show up to court, and the first thing the judge is going to say is probably not much. He's going to give the side eye to the city of Detroit and say, oh, we're here again on something that's less academic than the first time around. Like, judges typically want to see like the issues get more complex and complicated if you're going to come back on litigation. Not
Really
the other
seems
way.
like they didn't follow his instructions from last time, eh?
It doesn't. And, you know, somebody raised an issue, I think it was through Safer Mish, is that Detroit is acting as if they don't really want recreational cannabis. And it's hard to, and I get it. They want to.
There's years of not responding in any way that makes sense, you know. So that's not.
They don't want the current
too
people
surprising.
profiting from cannabis to be the people that profit from adult use cannabis. They would like to.
Which goes back to their intent, right? This is like, and their intent is pretty plain to see, because it's also like there's discrimination on space and discrimination by intent, right? This is discrimination by intent because it's like, hey, we don't like the current medical marijuana business owners because they're not Detroiters, right? That says a lot. It's not that they're just a certain type, and you can argue that this is directly targeting a certain, race or ethnicity by saying, hey, look, we don't want you until late. We want to give everybody else the chance. And they thought that was a clever way around it.
The judge, Bernard Friedman, in the first case, basically said you've created a discriminatory situation where you've given too much favoritism to Detroiters, and only to specific Detroiters, not to all Detroiters, which is really what tripped them up. This particular one, though, as you mentioned, the error, the legal challenge is pretty easy to see. House of Dank is the actual company that has filed this, which has several facilities around the state, including Traverse City, which I didn't know about till just today, and several in Detroit itself. So certainly that would be one of the significantly aggrieved parties, right?
Yeah,
Most of their stores are medical only, right?
Exactly.
Who have been operating for years, who have been donating, have helped neighborhoods, have been donating tax money, have shown that they're good stewards and good business people, to the point to where they've been around for years now, right? So, and it seems like equal protection is the word I keep hearing in this state, to where these folks keep violating it, and no matter what they do, it always comes back to some sort of discriminatory issue.
When you're saying these folks, you mean Detroit City Council?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, because they keep passing ordinances that clearly, even those of us without Juris Doctorate degrees can see probably not going to pass legal muster. And again, as Paul mentioned, we can see the purpose behind what's going on. Obviously, they want to transition the industry from a bunch of non-Detroiters owning businesses to Detroiters owning businesses. But I'm not sure what the legal pathway is to accomplish that. But certainly this isn't it.
Nobody disagrees that they should have, that the things should be equal, and we want Detroiters to succeed, and we want Detroit to have these businesses, and we want folks to be involved in the community and be involved in the industry, but you cannot do it at the expense of discriminating against others. It defeats the whole purpose.
Detroit has a history of trying things like residency requirements for city employees and things like that too, and not having success at the court system. So one wonders at what point is the legal department saying something and the city council's not listening, or the legal department's just not being very honest with council.
Or they just have a real shit lawyer that they need to shop around for a new one.
Of course,
he's just handsome. So he's just sitting there being handsome at this point, which is fine.
In case nobody noticed, Adam has dropped off, it seems like, and hasn't returned. But if he did, he'd be welcome. And also, Trish is in the comments, who could join us anytime too. And if you want to get any word about Lobby Day or the Hemp Festival or Annie or whatever, please feel free to come on. And while we're just here for a moment, a couple people asked a little bit late, Avi, if caregivers or regular home growers are able to test samples with your lab.
Absolutely. That's how we started out. That was the first several years. And now, actually, in the past, we were only allowed to test for patients and caregivers with the card or the licensees in the market. But they changed that, and so now anyone 21 or over can come by and test.
Well, that makes sense because now everybody 21 and over has the right to cultivate, right?
Yeah, well, for a while, you could cultivate, you could have it, you could give it away, but you couldn't come to my lab and test it. But as of March 7th, now you can.
And what's the cost for one of those types of individual tests?
So right now, we're doing a caregiver special. Usually they want potency tests. We're doing those at a special. They're normally 60. Right now we're doing from 45. But we'll also match any safety compliance facility pricing if you get a better price out there.
I think we spoke about the requirement to travel out to someone's garden in order to sample that. That's a requirement for the regulated market only. When we're talking about caregiver samples or individual personal cultivation samples, that's something people would bring into the lab then, correct?
Yeah, so for those samples, you're kind of on your own as far as the random sampling. So if you want your sample to be representative of your batch, do some random sampling, try and grab, buds from several different locations or average looking buds. Some people just want the highest potency and they, pick the best looking bud. That's pretty common too. But if you really want the actual representative data, you're kind of on your own. But if you have any questions, you can absolutely reach out and we're happy to help.
What volume do they need to bring in order to have an accurate test?
So depending on what test you want, if you want a potency test, we can get away with a gram or even less. If you want the whole full compliance with all the, pesticides, microbials, metals, and everything, we need about 7 grams minimum.
So what comes with the potency test? Do you get into the major terpenes on that, other things on the cannabinoid profile, or are you strictly just telling somebody what the THC percentage is?
Yeah, so terpene is a different test. Right now we're doing 20 cannabinoids, so we're expanding that list all the time. So we're doing 20 right now, which is a pretty good advantage. And on the terpene side, we're doing 60 terpenes. And we're also doing VSC3, which is it's not a terpene, but it's the chemical that causes the skunk aroma. And it's now under investigation as, for the medicinal benefits as that as well. We're going to be the first lab to actually quantify that. We had to get the standards made custom special for the first time for us.
Say that chemical again, please.
VSC3, it's volatile sulfur compounds. And VSC, there's I think VSC 1 through some higher number, but 3 is the one that's most common. So usually if you find the 3, the other ones are in there. And we plan to measure the other ones as well in the future. But right now we're starting with the most common.
And is that something that you would require some kind of separate ISO certification for? Do you have to submit some kind of new plan of action to the CRA in order to authorize those tests? What's the plan here?
So we have to get it on our scope, which involves us, having a valid method, proving that it's valid, and getting it on our ISO scope with our ISO 17025 accreditors. And in most cases with this, it's not a required test by the CRA. Terpenes are not required either. But when you do run a test, they do want to see your validation. And I think they can stop you if they don't want you to do something.
Right. But this doesn't seem like anything that they would want to interrupt. I mean, you're just testing for a novel terpene at this point, right? A newly explored kind of a molecule.
Yep.
And how many people do you employ down there at Steadfast?
So right now we're 25. We're bringing on 2 more, and we kind of have a skeleton crew for the midnight shift and on the weekends, but we're pretty much 24/5 for sure, and then skeleton crew on the weekends.
Nice. Thank you for making such a big impact on the community itself. Obviously, it's a good reason to have labs in your community is for job creation as well as for participation in the medical program.
What's your website?
Steadfastlabs.com.
Paul, is your microphone back going, sir? I'm so sorry. Anton, please go ahead.
Avi, what is the type of qualifications if I wanted to walk into your lab and apply for a job? Do I need some sort of scientific degree, or what needs to happen for me to be in, maybe actually gain employment with y'all?
So there's a range. I mean, we have PhDs down to people with almost no technical experience. It's good to come in with some because we have more positions for kind of people that in the old days we could hire someone and just train them soup to nuts, but now we don't have as much time. So we like to bring in people that have a certain you have to train people extensively, but if people have a technical background, that usually really helps them with their, being able to get trained and demonstrate competency, and just the confidence seems to be a big deal. But we do have other positions from data entry where you don't need really any technical experience, just a really good attitude.
Paul's connection is faulty at the moment here, as we can tell. Maybe he's coming back. Hopefully he will. Most of the time it works. But I'm glad we had some further questions that kind of came late, but I'm glad you stuck around to get back into some of this stuff, because this is pretty good. A lot of people want to know about that.
Well, Hazel Park is a small community. I lived there for over a decade, and it's really sort of embraced the cannabis business environment. We just talked earlier today. Anton mentioned an event at a cannabis social club, which is located in Hazel Park. There are dispensaries, I think, located in Hazel Park. So when you look at a community that's literally, I think, 1 mile wide and 2 miles tall, essentially, that's Hazel Park. They've really gone all in on this. Does it feel good being welcomed by the community in which you've decided to set up shop, Avi?
Yeah, absolutely. And we were the first cannabis business in 2015, and they weren't allowing dispensaries, obviously, back then. But we just went to the city council in those days. We just had to get their permission and said, hey, they said, are you growing anything? No. Are you selling anything out of there? No. Just testing. And they said, okay. And so they were even supportive of the safety aspect and the testing way back when. And it's a great place. It's a great local community, and the people running Hazel Park are great. And it's just, you're right, that we have embraced the cannabis industry here, and there's a lot of great businesses already running in Hazel Park.
And Hazel Park is just adjacent to the city of Detroit. The very famous 8 Mile Road is the northern border of Detroit along much of its length, and Hazel Park is adjacent to it, right there at DeQuinder and 8 starts. So,
Yep.
Paul, are we back again, sir?
How about now? Can you hear me?
All right.
Finally.
Well, Paul, so we talked about the city of Detroit and some of the difficulties that they have, but it's true that there is severability. So cannabis industries in the cultivation and the testing, the transport, those type of companies can continue going forward in the licensing process, right?
Yeah, so the industry side can still go forward. The retail side's cut off. It limits, and as Detroit calls it, it cuts off the numeric numbers, or the limited numbers, limited licenses, which would be retail, consumption lounge, and micro business. But yeah, you can get the unlimited, which is your production side. All those are still available, and I believe that the first one was awarded last week.
I saw that on Facebook too.
Which is smart. I'm seeing more efficiency, because a lot of the city is saying, it's like, okay, well, your zoning is good, your inspections are good, you're already there. You're asking us just to adopt essentially a companion license in the same location. Let's go through some formalities and get it done, rather than having to go through
and cut us a check.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. They want that more than anything, and there are a lot of places that have been, and a lot of growers especially, right? They've been unable to deal with the rest of the state by and large, because Detroit's the largest medical market at this point. A lot of those guys really can't wait to get and have recreational outlet.
Chris Webber has a huge campus. Chris Webber has a huge campus in Detroit. Al Harrington with his Viola brand has a huge cultivation center in Detroit. And when you're limited to just being able to produce for the medical market on a statewide level, Avi's nodding his head, he knows, the medical market is shrinking. I reported on the news last week that the medical market shrunk 17% in the month of April, even though overall we improved 27% as an entire industry. So that shows you exactly how skewed our relationship is, how much more aggressively the recreational market's moving than the medical. So opening the door to recreational cultivation is literally making millions and millions of dollars for these people who've already invested in Detroit.
Oh yeah, so people
right.
Can't wait. So Paul, let's say this current legal challenge gets resolved one way or the other. Are there other constitutional questions that could end up holding this up if other parties were to step forward and want to take another suit to the federal judge? Or would this be
a lawyer who's getting paid will say yes, whether or not it's worth it. But there's some strategy to some surrounding neighborhoods to stall Detroit's recreational market. There's some benefit and some strategy to some new big footprints in the suburbs to stalling Detroit's recreational market. There's some fulfillment of Detroit's ultimate spirit and intent by the delay, because what you're doing is you're eliminating those who express interest, and you're locking those in who can't go anywhere, and you're creating availability for those who want to be here. And that's what, if Detroit's retail locations are neighborhood stores serving, the immediate neighborhood, rather than trying to be a 10,000 square foot strip on 8 Mile, that might be what more of Detroit wants, but they're not, and I have this conversation all too often, is that Detroit really was positioned to be the leader in recreational marijuana. They really could have, continuing with the success that they had with the medical market, they really could have led the way. And
they could have embraced it before it was recognized on a statewide level.
They had 300 dispensaries at one time. 300 dispensaries open in Detroit under the medical market, which they could have embraced and folded right in, and have been collecting revenue from all of those this entire time instead of trying to shrink it down. Of course, there's a big religious factor in the city of Detroit too. Religious leaders are vehemently opposed to what we're talking about.
Well, and that touches on a bigger issue too, Rick, is that you're saying, well, okay, well, everybody knows that Detroit needs money to accomplish basic civil services and civic services to garbage and the like, but it's not, I guess, as they would say, and this is the whole risk in Detroit, is that not at the risk of throwing our city away. And they weren't throwing their city away. Those businesses were turning nothing into something. And the thing that really gets me is that when you go down Gratiot or any of the locations where there used to be a string of stores that are no longer, well, nothing's there still, right? It's been 3 or 4 years since those places are gone, and they're empty, right? They were empty. They were a dispensary. They spent a bunch of money and created a bunch of revenue. Now they're empty again. So it's not like Detroit is seeking to actually benefit the citizens and the influx of development tax dollars. They want to do it on their terms, even if it's counterproductive or even somewhat damaging.
Yeah. Well, and I think protracted lawsuits are damaging also too. I think it destroys confidence in the city. If you're a big national company and you're deciding where in Michigan you want to lay down your footprint because you're an MSO, let's just say, you probably are not looking at Detroit because of the volatility of the regulations, right? You're probably looking at going to Lansing. Weberville is huge with these facilities. Kalkaska. You could go to the west side. There are some Grand Rapids area communities, Muskegon, for example, which are opening their arms to particular industry reps. And Detroit really hurts themselves because those are jobs that are not going to be located in a city where probably they would be looked upon favorably. You know,
many surrounding towns and cities around Detroit are going for it and starting to take up that market share before Detroit gets going. Go ahead, Avi. Sorry.
Yeah, so we were with our expansion, we started in Hazel Park, but when we were looking at our expansion, we were looking at Detroit. That was actually our first choice, but with all the uncertainty, we decided we couldn't do it. And so you're absolutely right. It plays a big role there. And another aspect here is it's harder now. So for the first kind of 2 or 3 years of the regulated market, people could sell anything that they were making. There was a shortage of product. We're kind of getting out of that now. And so the businesses that are just starting up now and be starting in the future in Detroit are going to have a much harder path than some of the other guys that started 2 years ago and made a bunch of money.
It's one of the problems with social equity is that when we bring social equity in, it's a wonderful thing, but it comes at such a delay from the start of the program that all the best retail spots are already taken, that all the best scenarios are already grabbed up, and people have already had a protracted amount of time to develop brand loyalty and identity and to develop a customer base. So now you're making social equity awards, and good for you, but those social equity applicants don't get the same opportunity for success as the very first entrance into the marketplace go. And every month that we delay doing something better with social equity is another month that everybody's put behind the 8 ball. And if you're a social equity qualifier, you've already been through enough hardship. We don't need to create it and make it even worse and more difficult.
And I tell you what, Rick, I tell you what is that the Detroit actually, in a lot of ways, stabs social equity in the back, because with social equity, the ability to advance with social equity is the combination of having the social equity status and the ability and skill set to succeed. So when Detroit said, okay, no more weed shops, we're going to cut out 300 weed shops and leave them to number 50 or 60, you essentially did the equivalent of closing down factories and then wonder why your town has no manufacturing skill set. And they wonder why you can't translate this lack of skills into success. And no one wants to hear it when you point out that you threw out 250 job opportunity locations that translates into 50 jobs apiece. So you threw out so many skilled or industry specific jobs that could have translated well for all of Detroit.
They didn't sensibly embrace what was going on there. So many people willing to fix everything up without the city having to pay a dime, and then to be able to create so many jobs and bring people in for all the other, surrounding affected, businesses and restaurants and all that kind of stuff that we saw in a lot of communities that chose to embrace it.
And to go from 250 or 275 down to 50 means the city really chose winners and losers because of enforcement actions. They let some go, and then they took others down. And I think a lot of the people who were in small businesses were those that got taken down.
So funny part about that. I was gonna say, funny part about that is that out of those, let's say 275, the percentage of Detroit ownership out of those 275 was certainly higher than it is with the 60 that you have left. Because the
Damn
275, you did have neighborhood stores, you did have local stores, you did have community-based businesses that people could walk to that served the location that employed the locals, and those all gone. They're still empty.
It was super inexpensive to operate those places because there wasn't any compliance, it wasn't any regulatory. You could negotiate whatever price you wanted on incoming cannabis. So it was easy for a small business person or a guy in Detroit to be able to just flip open, an old gas station, or we used to use banks with Big Daddies. We used to grow cannabis.
Strip mall store that was been closed for 3 years before they opened it up and did something with it.
That's right.
So we're over time, but that's okay. This is interesting as long as nobody minds. There's no real restriction that we're here, but it is 6 o'clock, so it's time to kind of wind down. Paul, your audio got bad again here toward the end, just to let you know. Because you put those back in just habitually. But Avi, any final thoughts before we shut down?
I just want to thank you guys for having the show and having me on. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to come back, and I really appreciate that we have this conversation about these topics. I think it's really important, and I think we're doing our best to educate the consumers about all these things that we feel so strongly need to be conveyed.
Thanks, man. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, we'll definitely, we'll have another conversation down the road and see what's going on with the state of things in Michigan cannabis lab testing. Hey, Paul, anything you want to add?
Yeah.
For sure.
No, I mean, I think we're at an interesting point now with Detroit cannabis and with, I guess, things moving forward, and I'm ready for it to be over with. I think Detroit deserves better, and it's 2022. This is it's old hat, right? Just do it and get it done with. It's not like you're reinventing the wheel. It's not like you're the first guy through the door. It's not like there are a whole lot of unknowns anymore, right? This isn't 5 years ago. Just get it done.
They were getting good information and could demonstrably see how it could be beneficial in front of their face for many years. So this can't really expect much sensible policy to come out of people that have ignored that for so many years in a row. Anton?
I appreciate it, Avi. It was a great conversation. I think you have important perspective that folks need to hear, and I'm glad you were able to share that with us today.
So, Rick, mind wrapping us up?
Well, we have a ton of information we gave to people today as far as what testing labs are doing, the state of cannabis in Michigan, issues with Detroit, generalized concerns about the way cannabis is evaluated. It's a lot to take in. I hope that you're able to tune into our YouTube channel or our Buzzsprout network through all the different places that we're at. Spotify, listen to the episode a second or a third time, because you might need to do that in order to pick up all the great stuff that we laid down today. What a wonderful episode it was. Thank you, Avi, for joining. Thanks to Adam, who's no longer here. And thanks to everyone else who showed.
But, Jazz Cabbage Cafe, thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
And
All right, be smart, be safe.
see you again next week.
Bye now.